I am Joshua, 32 years old, and I just sold my tech company for $20 million, only to have my own flesh and blood immediately plot my financial ruin. Before I tell you about how I legally trapped them in their own web of greed, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The ink on the acquisition contract was completely dry. $20 million. I sat in the glass-walled conference room of my firm, staring down at the signature that had just changed the entire trajectory of my life. My hand was actually shaking. I had spent the last 7 years of my life sleeping on cheap office floor mats, eating out of vending machines, and sacrificing every personal relationship I had just to keep the lights on. Now, the war was over. I had won. Sitting across from me was Gabriel. He was my lawyer, but over the years of fighting off predatory investors and navigating the brutal startup world, he had become my closest confidant. Gabriel was in his late 50s, always impeccably dressed, with a mind like a steel trap. He didn't celebrate like normal people. He just watched me quietly as he organized the final documents and snapped his leather briefcase shut. I looked up at him, the adrenaline finally settling in my veins. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I told Gabriel I was going to call my parents. For my entire life, I had been the invisible child. I was the one who was expected to figure things out on my own, while my parents poured all their affection, attention, and money into my younger brother, Caleb. I thought this was the moment that would finally change everything. I thought $20 million would finally buy me my father's respect and my mother's love. Gabriel stopped what he was doing. He placed his hands flat on the mahogany table and looked at me with an expression that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a look of congratulation. It was a look of profound warning. He told me to put the phone down for a second. He leaned in and gave me a piece of advice that sounded entirely insane at the time. He told me to call my parents, but not to tell them about the sale. Instead, he instructed me to tell them that the deal had violently fallen apart. He wanted me to say that a massive, unexpected lawsuit had drained all my operating capital, that the company was seized, and that I was completely, hopelessly broke. I laughed out loud. I asked him why in the world I would ruin the greatest day of my life with a lie like that. Gabriel didn't smile. He explained that sudden, massive wealth acts like a truth serum on families. It strips away all the polite manners and reveals exactly who people really are. He told me that over the past few weeks, while preparing my financial portfolio, he had dug into the old family trust, the inheritance my grandmother Eleanor had set up before she passed away. He told me he found irregularities. Things didn't add up. He suspected my parents were hiding something massive from me. He said that if I wanted to know whether my parents loved me as their son, or merely saw me as a walking ATM, I needed to play the fool. I trusted Gabriel more than anyone else in the world. So, with a heavy heart, I dialed my mother's number. She picked up almost immediately. Her voice was bright, chirpy, anticipating good news. I forced my voice to crack. I took a shaky breath and told her the lie. I told her the investors pulled out, the accounts were frozen, and I had absolutely nothing left. I asked her if I could come home for a few days to figure things out. The silence on the line was deafening. It wasn't a shocked silence. It was the silence of a calculator processing numbers. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. It was cold. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what happened to the company. She just said she needed to speak privately with my father, and she hung up. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from my father. I opened it expecting a lifeline. Instead, the message read, "Don't come home. We can't afford your recklessness." Recklessness. I stared at the word until it blurred. I had built an empire with zero help from them, and the second they thought I was in trouble, they locked the door. Gabriel watched my face fall. He simply nodded, told me to go home, lock my doors, and wait. He promised me they would make a move. I didn't sleep a single second that night. I sat in the dark on my couch, the silence of my apartment pressing down on me. At 3 a.m., my phone lit up the room. It was a message from my cousin, Chloe. Chloe was the only person in our extended family who possessed a shred of human decency. The message simply said, Joshua, I am so sorry. You need to see this. Attached was a screenshot. It was from a private family group chat that I didn't even know existed. My eyes scanned the blue and gray text bubbles. The timestamps showed the conversation had started exactly 2 minutes after my mother hung up on me. My mother's message was at the very top. It read, "This is our chance." Underneath it, Uncle Robert replied. Robert was a miserable man, completely ruined by a bitter divorce and a brutal custody battle 5 years ago. He hated anyone who had what he didn't. His message read, "If he's broke, he's useless. Cut him loose before he asks for money." Then my father's text, "Pull the paperwork before he realizes. We move fast in the morning. Don't let him know about the trust." And finally, my 28-year-old brother, Caleb, the golden child. He wrote, "Told you he'd crash." He never deserved any of it anyway. My stomach dropped into my shoes. The trust. They had always told me my grandmother's trust was completely empty, drained by bad stock market bets years ago. They had lied. And now, believing I was entirely vulnerable and desperate, they were circling like vultures. Gabriel was completely right. My family wasn't grieving my failure. They were calculating how to profit from it. The hours between 3 a.m. and sunrise were the longest of my entire life. I paced the hardwood floor of my apartment, my bare feet cold against the wood. Every time I tried to sit down, a new wave of adrenaline and nausea forced me back up. The screenshot from Chloe was permanently burned into my mind. I couldn't stop looking at it. As the sky outside my window slowly turned from black to a bruised, dull gray, the floodgates of my memory opened. The text messages shouldn't have shocked me. The signs had been there my entire life. I had just been too desperate for their love to see them. I thought back to the day I got my acceptance letter to the state university. I was thrilled. I ran into the kitchen to show my parents. My father barely glanced at the letter before telling me the economy was too tight. He said I would have to figure it out myself. I spent the next 4 years drowning in student loans, working graveyard shifts at a warehouse to pay for my books. I barely slept. But 3 years later, when Caleb decided he wanted to attend a private, out-of-state liberal arts college, my parents suddenly unlocked a massive college fund. They paid for his tuition, his luxury dorm, and his meal plan entirely in cash. When I asked my father about it, he simply told me that Caleb needed a different environment to thrive. I thought about my early 20s. I was working a grueling corporate job, desperately trying to climb the ladder. I was up for a major promotion. It was a role that would have doubled my salary and finally allowed me to pay off my crippling debt. The night before my final interview with the regional director, my father called me in a panic. Caleb had been arrested 2 states over for a drunken bar fight. My father demanded that I drive through the night, post Caleb's bail, and find him a lawyer. I begged my father to go himself, explaining how important the interview was. He told me that family always comes first, and if I didn't go, I was no son of his. I made the drive. I bailed Caleb out. I missed the interview. I lost the promotion. When I finally got Caleb back to my parents' house, he didn't even look me in the eye to say thank you. My parents just hugged him and told him everything would be okay. The memories kept coming, each one a sharp pain in my chest. When I finally quit my miserable job to start my tech company, my parents told everyone I was having a mental breakdown. For the first 2 years, I took absolutely zero salary. I survived on cheap pasta and tap water. The only person who stood by me was Julian, my brilliant chief operating officer. Julian and I built the software from the ground up, pitching to hundreds of investors who slammed doors in our faces. During those brutal years, my parents never once asked how the business was doing. They only called me if Caleb needed his rent paid, or if they needed me to fix their home Wi-Fi. The only person who ever truly loved me was my grandmother, Eleanor. I vividly remembered the day of her funeral. It was pouring rain. I stood by her graveside as the casket was lowered into the muddy earth. I was heartbroken, but as we walked back to the cars, I overheard my mother and father arguing loudly about the catering bill for the wake. completely unfazed by the fact that they had just buried a woman who had worked her entire life to provide for them. Eleanor used to hold my hand and tell me that my independence would be my greatest weapon. She told me to never let my parents extinguish my fire. I finally understood what she meant. At exactly 7:14 a.m., the silence of my apartment was shattered by my ringtone. I stared at the caller ID. It was my mother. I cleared my throat, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I pressed accept and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello, Joshua, sweetheart." Her voice flowed through the speaker, dripping with artificial warmth and concern. It was the voice she used when she wanted the neighbors to think we were the perfect American family. "Hi, Mom," I said, keeping my tone flat and exhausted. "Your father and I have been up all night sick with worry about you," she lied, her voice trembling slightly for dramatic effect. "We know you're in a terrible spot with the business collapsing. We want to help you, honey. We really do. We need you to come by the house today, first thing this morning. There are some things we need to handle to protect you." I gripped the edge of my kitchen island so hard my fingers ached. I knew exactly what she was trying to handle. "What kind of things?" I asked quietly. "Just some family paperwork, sweetheart. To sort out your next steps and keep the creditors away from the family. It's better if we just do it quickly. Drive safe, we love you." She hung up before I could ask another question. I put the phone down. I walked into the bathroom and stared at my reflection. My eyes were red and sunken, but the desperation that used to live in them was completely gone. I splashed ice-cold water on my face. I dried my hands, grabbed my car keys, and walked out the door. I was walking straight into the lion's den, but this time I wasn't the prey. The drive to my childhood home took exactly 45 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. The morning sun was bright, cutting through the crisp air, illuminating the perfectly manicured lawns of my parents' upscale suburban neighborhood. Everything looked so incredibly normal on the outside. I turned onto my parents' street and let my car slowly roll toward their property. As the house came into view, my foot hit the brake pedal hard. My car jerked to a stop in the middle of the road. I stared through the windshield. Parked squarely in the middle of the wide, paved driveway, gleaming aggressively in the morning sunlight, was a brand-new, jet-black Porsche 911. The dealer tags were still on the back. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ground together. Caleb didn't work. He hadn't held a legitimate job since he was a teenager. He lived off a monthly allowance my parents provided, claiming he was finding his passion. A car like that cost well over $150,000. There was absolutely no way he qualified for a loan on his own. The sickening reality hit me like a physical blow. Caleb had bought the car on massive credit. He was banking on a sudden, massive influx of cash. He was banking on my downfall. He actually believed that the money my parents were about to steal from my side of the family trust was going to pay off his luxury sports car. I slowly pulled my car forward and parked on the street, refusing to pull into the driveway next to that monument of greed. I turned off the engine, took one massive, steadying breath, and stepped out. The walk up the concrete path felt like walking to an execution. I didn't bother knocking. I reached out, turned the heavy brass handle, and pushed the front door open. The air inside the house was thick, stifling, and heavily air-conditioned. It felt completely staged, like a theater set waiting for the main actor to hit his mark. My mother was standing in the immaculate kitchen, wiping down a marble countertop that was already perfectly clean. Caleb was sprawled across the expensive leather sectional sofa in the living room, wearing designer sweatpants, rapidly texting on his phone with a smug, self-satisfied smirk on his face. My father was sitting dead center in his large reclining armchair. Resting squarely on his lap was a thick, brown manila envelope. I closed the door behind me. The click of the latch echoed loudly. Nobody got up. Nobody walked over to hug me. Nobody asked me if I had slept, if I had eaten, or how I was mentally handling the supposed loss of my life's work. My mother finally looked up from the counter. She offered a tight, extremely forced smile. "Joshua, you're here." "I'm here," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. I stayed near the entryway, keeping my distance. My father didn't even pretend to care. He tapped his index finger against the brown envelope. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of paternal warmth. "Have a seat," he commanded, gesturing to the small chair opposite him. I walked slowly into the living room and sat down on the very edge of the cushion. Caleb didn't look up from his screen. "Heard you blew it all, bro," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Guess pretending to be a CEO is a lot harder than it looks on the internet. Good thing Mom and Dad are here to clean up your mess again." I ignored him entirely. I kept my eyes locked onto my father's face. "Mom said you guys wanted to help me," I said, playing the part of the defeated, broken son perfectly. My father leaned forward. He picked up the heavy envelope and tossed it onto the glass coffee table that sat between us. It landed with a heavy, ominous thud. He refused to meet my eyes, looking instead at a spot on the wall just behind my left shoulder. "We do want to help," my father said, his tone flat and heavily rehearsed. "But we have a responsibility to protect the family assets first. You are completely unstable right now, Joshua. You've made incredibly reckless choices with your investors, and we simply cannot let your financial ruin bleed into our lives and destroy what we've built. Sign these." He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a black pen, and slid it across the glass table. It spun and came to a stop right in front of me. "Sign what?" I asked softly, my eyes moving from the pen to the envelope. "It's just standard legal paperwork," my mother chimed in quickly, stepping out from the kitchen and crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "It's a temporary measure to separate your business liabilities from the family. It's better for everyone if you just do it quickly, Joshua. You always mess things up when you try to overthink them. Just let us handle this." I looked down at the envelope. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. I reached out, picked up the envelope, and felt the thick stack of paper inside. I pulled the metal clasp back and slid the documents out into the open. The bold, black letters at the very top of the first page screamed up at me. It wasn't a temporary protection document. It was a death warrant for my future. It read, "Revocation of beneficiary rights." I stared at the thick black ink. Revocation of beneficiary rights. The legal jargon was dense, but the intent was crystal clear. They weren't trying to protect the family from my fictional creditors. They were legally executing me. By signing this document, I would voluntarily and permanently surrender every single cent of my inheritance, transferring complete and total control to my parents. I kept my head bowed, staring at the paper, forcing my breathing to remain slow and even. I could literally feel the heat of their stares bearing down on me. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the obedient, desperate son they had conditioned me to be to blindly sign his life away for a scrap of their approval. "What exactly does this mean?" I asked, looking up at my father, keeping my face a mask of confusion. My father let out a harsh, irritated sigh, annoyed that I was daring to question him. "It means your grandmother's trust needs immediate protection. If your creditors come after you to liquidate your assets, they could petition a judge to claim your portion of the inheritance. By signing this document, you forfeit your share, keeping the money entirely safe with us. It's the only logical move to make." "Forfeit my share?" I repeated the words slowly, tasting the venom in them. "Permanently?" My mother took 2 quick steps forward, lowering her voice into that fake, soothing tone she always used to manipulate situations. "Joshua, listen to me. If you sign it right now, without a fuss, we won't pursue the clause in the trust that penalizes irresponsible heirs. You blew $20 million of investor money. We have to protect Caleb's future. You understand that, right? He still has his whole life ahead of him." There it was. The absolute truth laid bare on the table. It was always about Caleb's future. I slowly turned my head and looked at the sofa. Caleb was no longer just aggressively texting. He had shifted his position. He was holding his phone up, the camera lenses pointed directly at my face. I could see the red recording dot blinking on the screen. He was filming my humiliation. "What are you doing, Caleb?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Caleb smirked, completely unapologetic. He adjusted his grip on his phone to get a better angle. "Just getting some raw footage for Uncle Robert. He wants to see the exact look on the broke millionaire's face when he finally realizes he's got absolutely nothing left. Smile for the family chat, loser. Maybe I'll post it online." The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the moment took my breath away. My own blood brother was recording what he believed to be the lowest, most devastating moment of my life, just to provide entertainment for a bitter uncle. My mother didn't scold him. My father didn't tell him to put the phone down. They were entirely, totally complicit. I gently placed the documents back down onto the glass table. I did not touch the black pen. Slowly, deliberately, I slid my right hand into the pocket of my jacket. My fingers wrapped around my phone. I pressed the topside button twice in rapid succession. It was the speed dial shortcut I had programmed specifically for this moment. Called Gabriel. I knew he was sitting in his black SUV parked just 3 houses down the street. I left the phone in my pocket, the line open and listening. "I don't think I should sign this," I said, leaning back into the chair and crossing my arms. My father's face changed instantly. The mask of the stern, concerned patriarch vanished entirely, replaced by pure, ugly rage. A thick blue vein pulsed visibly on his temple. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. "You do not have a choice," he snapped, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. "You brought this disaster on yourself with your arrogance. You will pick up that pen and sign those papers right now, or you can walk out that front door and never, ever come back. Don't expect a single dime from us when you're sleeping in a cardboard box on the street." "I built a company from absolutely nothing," I said, raising my voice just enough to ensure Gabriel could hear every single word clearly through the phone in my pocket. "And my own parents are trying to steal my grandmother's inheritance just to pay for Caleb's brand new sports car in the driveway. You don't deserve the money," Caleb suddenly shouted from the couch, dropping his phone onto his lap and leaning forward aggressively. "You're a failure. You've always been a failure. Just sign the paper and get the hell out of our house." My mother slammed both of her hands down violently onto the marble kitchen island. "Joshua, stop being so incredibly dramatic. You are destroying this family with your selfishness." I looked at all 3 of them. My mother, shaking with fake indignation. My father, purple with rage. My brother, vibrating with unearned entitlement. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over my entire body. The storm was raging wildly around me, but inside my mind, the waters were completely still. The last tether of guilt holding me to these people snapped. "No," I said, my voice completely steady. My father stood up violently, his chair scraping loudly against the wood floor. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. "I am your father, and I am telling you to sign that document right this second, or so help me God." The heavy oak front door clicked open loudly. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed sharply on the hardwood floor of the entryway. My father froze mid-sentence, his finger still pointing. My mother spun around so fast she almost tripped. Caleb sat straight up, his phone sliding off his lap and falling between the cushions. Gabriel stepped fully into the living room. He was wearing his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, carrying his sleek leather briefcase. His expression was carved from solid granite. He looked around the room, taking in the chaotic scene with absolute, terrifying authority. "Good morning," Gabriel said, his voice smooth, polite, and cold as ice. "I see you've already started the proceedings without me." The silence that fell over the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on a carpet. My father stood frozen, staring at Gabriel with his mouth slightly open. He recognized him. Gabriel had represented me in some minor real estate contract disputes a few years ago, and my father knew exactly who he was and what he did for a living. "What the hell is this?" my father demanded, finally finding his voice, though it lacked the booming authority from moments ago. Why is your corporate lawyer standing in my living room? This is a private family matter. Gabriel didn't ask for permission to enter, nor did he apologize for the intrusion. He walked purposefully past my father and set his heavy leather briefcase down directly onto the glass coffee table, right on top of their fraudulent revocation documents. He flipped the brass locks. The sharp click-clack echoed through the silent room like a shotgun racking a shell. This ceased being a private family matter the moment you attempted to commit federal wire fraud and embezzlement, Gabriel said calmly, opening the lid of his briefcase. My mother's face drained of all color. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. She took a step backward, bumping heavily into the kitchen counter. I don't know what you're talking about. Joshua lost everything. His company was sued. We are simply taking steps to protect the family trust from his creditors. Gabriel pulled out a thick, bright blue legal folder from his briefcase. He didn't look at my father. He looked directly at my mother. Joshua didn't lose anything, Gabriel said, his voice carrying the weight of an anvil. He finalized the sale of his company yesterday afternoon for $20 million. The capital is currently sitting safely in a highly secure, diversified holding account. Caleb literally choked on his own breath. He started coughing, his eyes bulging out of his head. 20 million? He stared at me, his face twisting into a grotesque mask of shock, disbelief, and a sudden, desperate hunger. He followed my specific legal instruction to tell you he was completely broke, Gabriel continued, his voice slicing through the thick tension in the room like a scalpel. We needed to verify your true intentions before we brought the federal authorities into this matter. And unfortunately for you, Arthur, you took the bait completely. Bait? My father yelled, his face turning a dark shade of purple. The veins in his neck were pulsing. You set us up in our own home? You lied to your own parents. Gabriel slid the blue legal folder across the glass table. It stopped inches from my father's hands. I strongly suggest you open that folder, Arthur. My father hesitated, his hands shaking slightly, before he snatched the folder off the table. He ripped it open. I sat in silence and watched his eyes scan the top pages. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Inside that folder, Gabriel explained, pacing slowly behind my chair like a predator circling its prey, are certified bank statements, wire transfer logs, and notarized internal emails. They were securely provided to my firm by Elijah, the regional director of your bank. Elijah flagged your accounts 3 weeks ago for highly suspicious activity. You and Martha have been quietly liquidating the secondary investment accounts of the family trust, attempting to reroute hundreds of thousands of dollars into a private, offshore LLC registered entirely under Caleb's name. Caleb's head snapped violently toward our parents. You put a shell company in my name? He stammered, his voice cracking loudly as he suddenly realized he was legally implicated in a massive federal crime. You cannot prove any of this? My mother shrieked, her voice high-pitched and hysterical. She pointed a trembling finger at Gabriel. That money is for Caleb's future. Joshua doesn't need it. He never needed it. Gabriel stopped pacing. He leaned over the coffee table, planting both of his hands flat on the glass, dominating the physical space. He looked my father dead in the eye, his gaze unrelenting. Martha mentioned a very specific clause earlier, Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. The clause penalizing irresponsible heirs. Do you happen to remember the exact wording of that clause, Arthur? My father swallowed hard. The fight had completely left his body. He couldn't speak. I know that clause intimately, Gabriel whispered, because I am the attorney who helped your mother, Eleanor, draft the final amendments to her trust 10 years ago before she passed away. That clause doesn't apply to beneficiaries who make poor investments. It applies to trustees. It applies specifically to you. The room spun. I watched the horrible realization crash over my parents. They had tried to use my grandmother's words to destroy me, without realizing she had written those words to destroy them. Gabriel stood up straight, adjusting his suit jacket. The clause explicitly states that if the appointed trustees, you and Martha, are found to be acting in bad faith, mismanaging funds, or attempting to commit fraud against the beneficiaries, you are immediately, legally stripped of all your administrative powers. The trust, and all of its remaining assets, default immediately to the secondary executor. Gabriel slowly turned his head and looked at me. Joshua. This is the moment that changed everything. The moment the years of emotional abuse, the neglect, and the gaslighting finally ended. I watched the people who had belittled me, ignored me, and tried to rob me realize that they had just handed me the keys to their entire kingdom. They had walked right into the trap they dug for me. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please help me like the video and leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you've been with me this far. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The air was completely sucked out of the room. My father dropped the blue folder onto the glass table as if the paper had physically burned his hands. He staggered backward, falling heavily back into his recliner, staring at the floor in absolute, shattered disbelief. Caleb jumped up from the couch, his face pale and slick with sudden sweat. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him. His voice cracked in absolute, terrifying panic. Wait a minute. If Joshua controls the entire trust, what about my car? I financed the Porsche against my expected trust payout. The first massive payment is due next week. What about my credit cards? My rent? I slowly turned my head to look at my younger brother. For the first time in my entire 32 years of life, I felt absolutely nothing for him. No resentment, no anger, no jealousy. I just saw a pathetic, helpless man-child who had never been forced to face reality. You better start looking for a job, Caleb, I said, my voice eerily calm and steady. Because I am freezing your trust allowance, and I am cutting off your credit cards this afternoon. You're on your own. Caleb looked at our parents, his eyes wide with pleading desperation. Mom, Dad, do something. He can't do this to me. I'll lose the apartment. I'll lose the car. My mother rushed forward, tears streaming rapidly down her face, ruining her makeup. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed my forearm, her fingers digging desperately into the fabric of my jacket. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. Joshua, please, she sobbed, her voice breaking. We are your family. We are your blood. We raised you. We fed you. You cannot just take everything away from us like this. We made a mistake, okay? We were scared. We just wanted to make sure everyone in the family was going to be okay. I looked down at her hands gripping my arm. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I didn't curse at her. I just gently, but incredibly firmly, pried her fingers off my arm and stepped back, creating a physical boundary between us. You didn't raise me, Mom, I said, staring directly into her tear-filled eyes. You housed me. You raised Caleb. And you weren't scared this morning. You were incredibly greedy. You saw an opportunity to kick me while you thought I was down, to steal the only thing my grandmother left me, and you took it without a second thought. My father pushed himself out of his chair. He took a heavy step forward, his fists balled tightly at his sides. With his legal high ground gone, he resorted to the only tactic he had left: physical intimidation. You think you're punishing us? He growled, the veins standing out prominently on his thick neck. You're destroying this family, Joshua. If you walk out that door with this money, you are dead to us. Do you hear me? You will have no family left. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I stood my ground and stared right back into his angry, desperate eyes. You destroyed this family, Dad. You destroyed it the moment money mattered more than your own son. Gabriel, who had been standing silently observing the collapse of their empire, pulled a final, thin set of papers from his leather briefcase. They were clean, crisp, and completely devastating. He placed them neatly on the glass table, right next to a heavy silver pen. "This is the formal resignation of your trustee rights," Gabriel said to my parents, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Effective immediately. You will both sign this right now," voluntarily stepping down and transferring all control and administrative power to Joshua. "If you refuse to sign this document right now, I will pack up my briefcase, leave this house, call the federal authorities, and trigger a full court audit of every single bank account you have touched in the last 15 years. You will face federal embezzlement and wire fraud charges, and you will both likely go to federal prison." My father looked down at the crisp white papers. He looked up at Gabriel's unblinking eyes. He looked at me, standing tall and unbroken. He realized, finally and completely, that he was trapped. There was no negotiation to be had. There were no emotional strings left to pull. There was no manipulation left to play. His hands shook violently as he reached down and picked up the silver pen. He bent over the glass table, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, and scrawled his name on the dotted line. He threw the pen down in disgust. My mother sobbed hysterically as she picked it up, her tears physically dropping and staining the paper as she signed her name right next to his. Gabriel gathered the documents, carefully verified the signatures, and placed them securely back into his briefcase. He snapped the locks shut one final time. "Joshua is now the sole trustee," Gabriel announced to the silent room. "Any discretionary payouts, allowances, or distributions to anyone in this family are his decision alone." I stood up straight. I buttoned my jacket. I looked around the living room one last time. The house I grew up in, the house that used to hold so much power over me, felt entirely empty and incredibly small. There were no ghosts left to haunt me here. I turned my back on them. I walked out the front door, stepping out into the bright, warm morning sun, finally breathing the air of a truly free man. A full month had passed since I walked out of that house and left my parents and my brother sitting in the ruins of their own greed. 30 entire days of absolute, uninterrupted silence. The first 48 hours after I walked out that front door were exactly as chaotic as Gabriel had predicted. My phone practically vibrated off my kitchen counter. There were dozens of missed calls from my mother, frantic text messages from my father oscillating wildly between aggressive threats and pathetic apologies, and a barrage of voicemails from Caleb begging me to reconsider freezing his credit cards because his landlord was threatening eviction. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I didn't read the paragraphs of manipulation. I sat at my kitchen island, pulled up my carrier settings, and permanently blocked every single one of their phone numbers. I blocked Uncle Robert. I blocked every flying monkey in the extended family who tried to reach out to guilt-trip me into forgiving the unforgivable. I severed the infected limbs of my family tree with one clean, decisive stroke. And then, something incredible happened. The world didn't end. The sky didn't fall. For the first time in 32 years, I woke up in the morning and my chest didn't feel like it was wrapped in heavy iron chains. The chronic anxiety that had lived in the back of my neck since childhood simply evaporated. I was no longer the disappointing son. I was no longer the emergency ATM. I was just Joshua. I poured a massive portion of the $20 million from the sale of my company into a highly diversified portfolio, securing my future so completely that I would never have to worry about money for the rest of my natural life. But sitting still wasn't in my nature. Julian, my former chief operating officer and the only guy who had stood in the trenches with me during the darkest days of our startup, reached out. We decided to lease a beautiful, open-concept office space downtown to start laying the groundwork for a new venture. We weren't rushing. We were just enjoying the process of creating something new without the crushing pressure of survival hanging over our heads. It was a crisp Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my new oak desk, looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the city waking up below. Julian was in the other room interviewing a potential lead developer. I had a hot cup of black coffee in my hand, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound peace. The glass door to my office swung open. Gabriel walked in. He was wearing a sharp navy blue suit today, carrying that same iconic leather briefcase that had completely dismantled my parents' lives a month ago. He looked around the bright, spacious office and offered a rare, genuine smile. "The new headquarters suits you, Joshua," Gabriel said, taking a seat in the leather armchair opposite my desk. "You look remarkably rested. The dark circles under your eyes are finally gone." I leaned back in my chair and smiled. "Peace and quiet will do that to a person, Gabriel. It turns out that carrying the weight of a toxic family is terrible for your sleep schedule. How are things on the legal front? Has my father tried to file any ridiculous injunctions regarding the trust?" Gabriel shook his head, resting his briefcase on his lap. "Not a single one. Your father hired a bargain bin attorney to review the documents they signed, hoping to find a loophole to claim they signed under duress. His lawyer took one look at the embezzlement evidence Elijah provided us, looked at the federal fraud statutes, and immediately advised your father to drop it and pray we don't press criminal charges. They are completely boxed in. Caleb had to voluntarily surrender his brand new Porsche to the dealership last week to avoid massive debt collection. And from what I understand, he has been forced to move back into your parents' guest bedroom." I felt a brief flash of pity, but it vanished as quickly as it came. They had made their bed, and now they had to lie in it. The era of me financing their delusions of grandeur was permanently over. "Good," I said simply. "They can figure it out. They always told me to figure it out on my own when I was drowning in student loans and struggling to survive. Now it is their turn to learn the value of $1. Gabriel nodded slowly. The light, conversational tone of the room suddenly shifted. Gabriel didn't open his briefcase right away. He just looked at me with an incredibly serious, deeply respectful expression. "I didn't come here today just to give you an update on your parents' misery, Joshua," Gabriel said, his voice dropping into a quieter, more intimate register. "The legal proceedings regarding your parents' removal as trustees are officially finalized and filed with the state. You are now the sole, uncontested executor of the family inheritance. But there is one final piece of business we need to conclude. Something that has been waiting for this exact moment for over 10 years. I sat forward, setting my coffee mug down on a coaster. "What do you mean? What else is there?" Gabriel reached down and finally popped the brass locks on his briefcase. He didn't pull out a thick stack of legal jargon this time. He reached into a specialized interior pocket and pulled out a small, heavy velvet envelope. It was a deep, rich burgundy color, clearly aged, and sealed on the back with a thick stamp of red wax. He placed the velvet envelope gently on the center of my desk. 10 years ago, Gabriel began, folding his hands in his lap, your grandmother Eleanor came to my office. She was in the early stages of her illness, and she knew her time was growing short. She wanted to finalize the trust. But Eleanor was an incredibly observant woman. She saw exactly how Arthur and Martha treated you. She saw how they shamelessly favored Caleb, entirely funding his massive college fund while forcing you to take on crushing debt. She saw the greed taking root in your father's heart. My breath caught in my throat at the mention of her name. Eleanor, the only woman who had ever looked at me and seen someone entirely worthy of love. Eleanor knew that leaving you a massive sum of money outright would only make you a target, Gabriel continued softly. She knew your parents would use every emotional manipulation tactic in the book to drain your accounts to fund their lifestyle and Caleb's laziness. She knew they would eventually try to steal the family trust. That is exactly why she had me draft that specific penalty clause for fraudulent trustees. It was a trap she set 10 years ago, waiting patiently to snap shut the moment they revealed their true colors. I stared at the velvet envelope. My hands were actually trembling. She also knew, Gabriel said, pointing to the envelope, that surviving the eventual betrayal of your own parents would be the hardest, most painful thing you would ever have to do. She left this in my strict possession. Her explicit, legally binding instructions were that I was to hand this to you, and only you, the day after your parents permanently lost their power over you. Today is that day. I reached out with a shaking hand and picked up the envelope. The velvet was soft, holding the weight of a decade of hidden love. I slid my thumb under the heavy red wax seal and cracked it open. Inside was a single piece of heavy, ivory-colored stationery, folded neatly in half, and a heavy antique brass key. I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. Those elegant, looping cursive letters I remembered from all the birthday cards she used to secretly slip me when my parents weren't looking. The ink was slightly faded, but the words jumped off the page and struck me right in the center of my chest. My dearest Joshua, if you are reading this letter, it means the worst has finally happened. It means my son and his wife have allowed their greed to eclipse their duty as parents. It means you have seen their true faces, and you have survived the devastating heartbreak of their betrayal. I am so incredibly sorry that I could not be there to stand beside you when it happened. But please know this. I always knew your strength would come from surviving what others tried to break in you. You have a fire in your spirit that Arthur and Martha could never understand. And because they couldn't understand it, they tried to extinguish it. I am so deeply proud of the man I know you have become. The money in the trust is yours to manage, but I knew you would need a place to heal. A place entirely your own, untouched by their memories, far away from their demands. Accompanying this letter is the deed to a private estate I purchased in the mountains of Vermont shortly before I fell ill. Your parents do not know it exists. My lawyers do not know it exists. Only Gabriel knows. It is completely paid off, held in a private LLC solely in your name. This key is the real legacy I leave behind for you. Do not let their bitterness harden your beautiful heart. Joshua, walk away from the ruins of their greed, step into the light, and build a life filled with people who love you for exactly who you are, not for what you can provide them. You are free now, my sweet boy. With all my love, forever, Grandma Eleanor. A hot tear broke free and rolled down my cheek, splashing quietly onto the oak desk. I didn't bother wiping it away. Then another fell and another. For the first time in my entire adult life, I sat in front of another human being and allowed myself to openly, unapologetically cry. It wasn't the crying of a broken man. It was the crying of a man who had been carrying a massive, suffocating boulder up a mountain for 30 years, and had finally, miraculously, been allowed to set it down. Gabriel stood up quietly. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell me to cheer up. He just walked over, placed a firm, supportive hand on my shoulder for a long moment, and then quietly let himself out of the office, giving me the space I needed to grieve, to heal, and to finally accept the unconditional love I had been starving for my entire life. I sat there alone for a very long time, gripping the antique brass key in my palm, feeling the cold metal warm up against my skin. My parents had tried to bury me under a mountain of guilt and financial ruin, completely unaware that my grandmother had given me the tools to build a castle on top of it. Vermont in the early autumn is a landscape that fundamentally changes how you breathe. 2 weeks after Gabriel handed me that burgundy velvet envelope, I packed a single duffel bag, fueled up my car, and drove away from the concrete skyline of the city. I needed to see it. I needed to physically touch the legacy Eleanor had left me. The drive took hours, but it felt like minutes. As I crossed the state line, the congested highways gave way to winding, 2-lane mountain roads flanked by towering forests of pine, maple, and birch. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the mountainsides in explosive splashes of burnt orange, vibrant red, and deep golden yellow. With every mile marker I passed, I felt another layer of the old Joshua shedding away. The Joshua who desperately craved Arthur's validation. The Joshua who would have set himself on fire just to keep Caleb warm. They were gone, left behind on the side of the highway. My GPS finally told me to turn off the main road onto an unmarked, crushed gravel driveway that wound its way deep into a dense thicket of trees. I drove slowly, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my tires, the canopy of branches completely blocking out the modern world behind me. After a mile of winding through the forest, the trees suddenly cleared, opening up to a massive, breathtaking valley overlooking a crystal-clear private lake. And there it was. It wasn't just a cabin. It was a sprawling, gorgeous, custom-built timber and stone estate. It sat perfectly positioned on the edge of the water, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling A-frame windows that reflected the surrounding mountains, a wraparound cedar porch, and a heavy slate roof. It was majestic, silent, and entirely mine. The property taxes and maintenance had been quietly funded by a separate escrow account Gabriel had managed for a decade. It was a fortress of absolute peace. I parked the car, killed the engine, and stepped out into the crisp, cool mountain air. The silence was so profound it almost rang in my ears. There were no sirens, no traffic, no ringing cell phones, and no family members demanding my money or my time. There was just the sound of the wind rustling through the pines and the gentle lapping of the lake water against the wooden dock. I walked up the wide stone steps to the heavy oak front door. I pulled Eleanor's antique brass key from my pocket. My hand was incredibly steady as I slid it into the lock and turned. The heavy tumblers clicked into place. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was magnificent. Vaulted ceilings with exposed timber beams, a massive floor-to-ceiling river stone fireplace in the center of the great room, and a wall of glass looking out over the water. It was fully furnished, impeccably clean, and smelled faintly of cedar wood and old books. I walked slowly through the rooms, trailing my fingers over the backs of the leather armchairs, running my hand along the thick granite countertops in the kitchen. In the master bedroom, sitting squarely on the center of the king-sized bed, was a single, framed photograph. I walked over and picked it up. It was a picture of me and Eleanor, taken when I was 12 years old. We were sitting on a park bench, eating ice cream. I had chocolate all over my chin, and I was laughing so hard my eyes were closed. Eleanor had her arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated joy and fierce protection. I sat down on the edge of the bed, holding the frame in both hands. My parents had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was a secondary character in my own story. They used my empathy as a weapon against me. They viewed my success not as a point of pride, but as an unfair advantage I held over their golden child, Caleb. When Gabriel told me to call them and say I lost the $20 million, he wasn't just testing their greed. He was forcing me to look at the ugly, undeniable truth I had been running from my entire life. You cannot buy the love of people who fundamentally view you as a transaction. If your worth in your family is entirely dictated by what you can provide for them, whether it's money, favors, or simply acting as a scapegoat to make someone else feel better about their failures, then you do not have a family. You have a board of directors, and you owe it to yourself to resign. Walking away from the people who share your DNA is often framed by society as a massive failure. People will tell you that blood is thicker than water, or that you only get one mother and father. But what they don't tell you is that loyalty to toxic blood will slowly poison you to death. What they don't tell you is that sometimes, the most profound act of self-love you can possibly commit is looking the people who raised you in the eye and saying, "You are no longer allowed to hurt me." I didn't lose my family the day I walked into that living room and refused to sign away my beneficiary rights. My family ended itself the moment they created that group chat. I just finally had the courage to walk away from the wreckage. I set the photograph gently on the nightstand. I walked back out into the great room, opened the heavy glass doors, and stepped out onto the back porch. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long, spectacular shadows across the mirror-like surface of the lake. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, freezing mountain air. I had my health. I had a thriving new business with Julian. I had Gabriel, who had proven to be more of a father figure to me than Arthur ever was. I had a $20 million safety net, the family inheritance, and this magnificent estate. But more importantly than any of the money or the property, I finally had myself. I was free. The storm was finally over, and the dawn was breaking. This journey taught me a lesson that completely rewired how I view the world, and I want to share it with you, especially if you are currently sitting in the dark, struggling with the crushing weight of a toxic family. The ultimate educational truth I learned is this: boundaries are not walls built to keep people out. They are the doors you install to protect your own peace. We are socially conditioned to believe that we owe our parents an unpayable debt simply because they brought us into the world. But biological relation does not grant anyone a free pass to inflict psychological or financial abuse. Respect, loyalty, and love must be earned, and they must be reciprocal. If someone only loves the version of you that serves their needs, they do not love you at all. They love the convenience you provide. Walking away from an abusive family dynamic does not make you a bad son or a bad daughter. It makes you a survivor who finally chose to rescue yourself. True family is not defined by matching DNA. It is defined by the people who stand by you when you have absolutely nothing to offer them but your authentic self. If this story resonated with you, I want to hear your voice. What was the most profound lesson or moment in this story that struck a chord with your own life experiences? Share your perspective in the comments below. Or, if you simply agree that protecting your peace is always worth the price, just type the word "good" in the comments so I know you are standing strong with me. Thank you for listening, and remember, your peace is your most valuable asset. Never let anyone bankrupt your soul.